Otto the First was the son of Henry the Fowler, who himself was King of Germany between 919 and 936. Henry's early career was dominated by a marriage controversy. His attention had been caught by a woman called Habsburg. She was a widow who had sworn to take the veil after the death of her first husband. However, this didn't put off Henry, who was extremely eager to marry her. And indeed, the wedding did take place. Among the clergy, though, there was extreme disquiet over the match. Henry, not wishing to give in, went to seek the advice of the then German king at that time, Conrad I. Conrad seemed to sympathize with Henry and attempted to mediate between Henry and the clergy. In the end, though, Henry and Habsburg's marriage was dissolved. In 909, Henry made a second marriage. This time his bride was a woman by the name of Matilda. She was the daughter of a Saxon nobleman and would prove to be the mother of Henry's heir, Otto. Conrad I died in late 918. Before he died, he advised his nobility that they should elect Henry as his heir. He did this despite there being a breakdown in relations between himself and Henry through the 910s. Conrad's options were really limited as he had no children, and so, looking to the future, he had to put aside any ill will he might have had towards Henry in order to avoid civil war in his kingdom and ruin his own legacy. The nobility elected Henry king, and he was crowned about 6 months after the death of Conrad. The chroniclers are generous in their praise of Henry. One calls him the father of his country and the greatest and best of all kings. Thietmar of Mersburg shares in those sentiments and says that qualities that can be seen in Henry could also be found in his son Otto. Things didn't necessarily get off to the easiest start for Henry, however. On coming to the German throne, he insisted on certain regions, including Bohemia, on paying tribute to him. This didn't go down well, and the territories in question responded by rebelling against Henry. After a period, Henry managed to bring the Bohemians back into line. But a far bigger problem for him came in the shape of the Magyar invasions. This had been a problem in Europe since the previous century, and Henry had to find a way of dealing with this threat. Initially he attempted to react by force, but he came unstuck and was defeated in battle. His next tactic was essentially to pay them off. Bribing invading forces would not last forever, and indeed the Magyars would continue to be a thorn in the side for Henry for most of his reign. Henry would continue to strengthen his realm by building defensive fortifications and bringing rebellious regions back into line. He had successes against the Vikings and helped to Christianize some of his pagan enemies. Henry had repeated struggles against the king of West Francia, Charles the Simple, who ended his career in captivity. Pretending to be saddened by this, Henry hoped to take another of Charles's possessions, Lotharingia, which he first intended to do so by diplomacy if he could help it. The region, after Charles's death, had technically become the property of a man named Giselbert. Having met Giselbert and seen firsthand a young man of noble birth with the qualities required to rule, Henry reconsidered the matter and had him marry his daughter instead. This was a canny move. To all intents and purposes, Lotharingia was still in his hands, and had at the same time also made his daughter a good marriage. The next item on the agenda for Henry was to secure his dynasty and produce heirs. After the dissolution of his first marriage, he married Matilda. This marriage was successful in its primary purposes in that it provided Henry with sons and heirs. Two of them would become Dukes of Bavaria and Lotharingia, respectively. The firstborn, Otto, would become one of the most renowned of all early medieval European rulers. Queen Matilda also had something of an interesting family history. Some of her distant relations had been involved in the Saxon wars that would plague Charlemagne over a century earlier, and her uncles had fought against the Vikings. The fact her son became known as Otto the Great firmly establishes her own place in history. During the 9-year peace treaty with the Magyars that Henry had secured, Henry had not only been on a program of fortress building, but had also put in place plans for the men he had to garrison the fortifications. They were to train day and night in preparation for any invasion that might come, and he planned extensively to ensure that the men had the required provisions. These new strongholds would also be used for law courts and assemblies. These forts were especially needed. The chroniclers tells of the sparse strongholds throughout the kingdom that were either poorly maintained or damaged from repeated civil wars or from battles and sieges against the Magyars and other peoples. Thoughts now turned to Otto and his future. A match was made for him with Edith, the daughter of King Edward the Elder. According to Widukind, she was popular with the people and would produce for Otto 2 children, a son and a daughter. The marriage came at a particularly successful time for Henry in his campaign against the Magyars. He had secured the succession. Henry would succeed him as ruler of all his territories on Henry's death in 936. He had also repulsed Viking incursions and ruled over his kingdom with shrewdness and authority. When he died, aged around 60, his citizens mourned his passing. Widukind calls him the best of Europe's kings. He left his son an extended kingdom to rule over, and although Henry is not strictly a Holy Roman Emperor, his story is important in my series of videos on this subject because he really laid the platform for Otto the Great's succession. So I had to write his story into this as well. And further down the line, there are going to be other people that I talk about in these videos that are, although they're not actually Holy Roman Emperors, they keep the story rolling, if you will, and actually talking about them is absolutely unavoidable. So although this video is not really technically about Otto the Great, I will go into more detail about him in my next couple of videos. But this is kind of the groundwork to that. So talking about Henry the Fowler was unavoidable.